Right. Hi, Pawan, everybody. We have come a long way in our ecology lecture series, starting from individuals to communities, sorry, the populations to communities. And then we just last week we finished about the communities, right? But by we know that as biologists, all these are interconnected. Although we consider this as individual or population or community, but at the end, all of them are interconnected, and there are a lot of interaction between communities as well, right? So for ecologists, therefore, it's not the whole idea of studying about the individuals or communities or populations, but in reality, all these are in either as a ecosystems or a little bit more if you take it as the landscape, or even beyond that if you take it like a biosphere, like it's a one planet at the end. So these are all interlinked, right? So um, that's the reality, right? So for our study purposes, just to make things easier, we learn about these different things. If you want to study a little bit deeper into the subjects, that's where we'll study about the different components. But so this is the reality. They either as an ecosystem or it more than that, the landscape or the biosphere. So that's where actually we have to look into as biologists or rather as an ecologist. So today we talk a little bit on this ecosystems and landscape ecology. And these are actually the realistic ecology that we would see in the environment, right? If we just start with a small video just to get some insight. Here you go.
Hi, I'm Emerald Robinson, and in this What Is video, we're going to investigate Earth's ecosystems. An ecosystem is a community of living things interacting with the non-living parts of their environment. There are two primary parts of an ecosystem. The biotic part is made of all the living things like plants and animals, fungi, and bacteria and viruses. The abiotic part is made up of non-living things like rocks and minerals, water, and energy. Ecosystems can be almost any size. While most of us think of communities like a coral reef or a forest, an ecosystem can be a small pond or even the area beneath a large rock. Ecosystems need energy. In most cases, this energy comes from sunlight. Producers, like plants, take light energy and convert it into usable sugar energy through photosynthesis. As animals consume the energy from plants, they are eaten by other animals and ultimately decompose back into the soil. The energy moves through the ecosystem via a food web. Two of the most important concepts in the study of ecosystems are niche and habitat. A habitat is a place where an organism lives. Organisms must get nutrition, shelter, water, and the other things they need to survive from their habitat. Niche is an organism's special role in the ecosystem. What and how something eats, how it behaves, where it lives, all of these things define an organism's niche. Two organisms cannot occupy the same niche for very long. Eventually, one will outcompete the other for food and other resources, forcing the other to move or to go extinct. Many of the Earth's ecosystems are threatened due to climate change, pollution, and the human destruction of habitats. Scientists called ecologists study and monitor the health of ecosystems and continually work to discover new ways to protect these precious organisms and environments.
For thousands of how-to and advice videos,
Right, just a very brief introduction to just to get an insight about the ecosystem, which you already might know about these things. But so what really a ecosystem, and then what is the scale we are looking at? Um, now we'll come to the term scale. I think you have heard this term called the scale. Even in a map, there is a scale. Sometimes we call that small scale, large scale map. Right. So now the question for ecologists is in what scale we are looking at a issue. For example, uh, now these days the COVID, right? So it's a large scale. It's all over the world. Right? Because of that, it's a large scale we are looking at or we are considering, right? But something like isolated, even like some pollution in one area, so it's a small scale. Like so, in the ecology, we have to consider like what kind of a scale you are looking at when you are studying something, maybe some impact or anything you are studying in the ecology. So you have to think of the scale, whether in what kind of a scale you are looking at, right? So that term scale is very important when you are right. For example, here in this map, it's showing the large scale in the global primary productivity, right? So if someone going to work on this, it's going to be a huge project, right? So it's a global scale something, right? But in many cases, like us, we as ecologists usually work in a small scale things, like what is the impact of pollution on one species, but not even a particular species, a species in a particular area, maybe in a river, maybe in a pond, maybe in one forest, something like that. So usually we study in a small scale, right? So that is very important in what scale that you are studying your ecology, right? On the other hand, so what is really ecosystem, right? As you already know, is the two components, the biotic component and the abiotic components together we consider as the ecosystem. But the, the little different here is that when we define ecosystem, we can define its population of species grouped together into communities and interact with one another and with the biotic environment, right? So we're talking about the populations, but beyond that, it's a communities. It's not just the communities, but interacting communities, right? So some communities, but they are coming interacting with other communities as well, and everybody together interact with the biotic environment. So in simply, that is what is the ecosystem. Right? So I know that you heard these terms, I'm pretty sure, right? So now the problem with the ecosystem, if you're studying ecology into an ecosystem level or ecosystem ecology, the problem is it's very wide, very vast. To understand something is going to be really difficult, right? So that is the problem. So one of the reasons, that's why we break into small places, small areas, just to make things easy, right? But so therefore we are not going to go into very much detail on the ecosystem ecology. It's going to be a huge task, not for a first year level study. That's come to a little bit higher thing, but we just need to understand some of the terms that we will be um, talking when you're talking about the ecosystem, right? So the trophic structure. This also, I think you all have heard about this called the trophic structure. That's the like a feeding relationships, right? And then the food webs and food chains, how these energy transfer, these things I think you have heard about. Right? So basically we call this as a trophic structure. But one of the key thing in an ecosystem is this kind of a trophic structure. So how they are arranged in a food chains and food webs, something like that, right? Um, Another thing is the connectivity, right? The how connected they are in an ecosystem. Like maybe some communities. So in an ecosystem, there are many different communities. How they are interconnected? What kind of what degree? So how close they are? Um, uh, that kind of a relationship, so connectivity we need to think of, right? So that is called the connectivity, how closely they are arranged, right? Um, Another thing in a ecosystem, we can see these the relationships that may be tropics or other relationships. Sometimes we call bottom-up relationships. Some are top-to-bottom relationship, right? Um, I'm not too sure that you have heard this one, right? But like when we talk about the management, we call the top-to-bottom management and bottom-to-top management. Sometimes the bottom people take a decision and it come to the top. Just like in the university, you usually have a sort of a bottom to top, like a department, faculty, and like a council. It's a bottom to top. But there are some many cases is top to bottom. Right? Even in ecosystem, there are some of the things that controlled by the bottom level. Some things are controlled by the top level. Right? Um, for example, we can take as like a predator. Right? Predators are always in the top of a food chain. So we know that the predators are very important. They play a very important role in the ecosystem. So in that case, it's a top to bottom control. Because if you remove that predator, the next level will dominate, right? And that will destroy the whole perhaps the ecosystem, right? On the other way, sometimes it can be bottom to top. Like here, it's given a example as like the fertilizer. Any deficiency in a fertilizer will reduce the plant growth, right? So if there is no enough plant, which means the whole ecosystem will collapse again, right? So so it's not only the top to bottom that has control, but bottom to top control as well, right? So we have to keep in mind. Uh, so it's not really that. In many cases, we consider like the top predators are the most important group, that they are the one who keep in the ecosystem balance, but it is not always, right? Sometimes can be the bottom level, right? So it's depend on the species and the situation, right? So that's where all the component in the ecosystems are important, including the decomposers, the bacteria. Right? So this control from both sides, from bottom to top as well as top to bottom, right? So each level in a trophic status or in the ecosystem is very important, right? So we need to understand that very clearly to be a ecologist, right? Um, and the other important thing in an ecosystem are the nutrient and the energy, and particularly the nutrient, right? So um, these two components, nutrient and energy, is very important, and particularly the nutrient. So we know that uh, the nutrients usually in the amount of nutrient in the environment, there is no large source of nutrient. We know that, right? So we are not getting too much nutrient from some other planets or somewhere else, right? Everything, the nutrient that we have usually actually recycled within our, maybe in the ecosystem or even in the within the planet. So these are usually recycled, right? But the energy, we get energy from the sun, so it's not really recycled, right? So I don't think I have to go to that detail. You know these things. So energy usually is not really recycled, uh, but we are getting from from the sun, right? So but nutrient, they do recycle. So basically they cycle through within the ecosystem or within our the areas, right? So we talk about the nutrients and their recycling or nutrient cycles, but energy, but energy is flow from one chain, one trophic level to another trophic level is a flow. Then energy වෙන්නේ ගලාගෙන යන එක through the food chains, right? So if there is an energy lost, that lost is actually through the metabolism or the growth, right? හැබැයි අපි දන්නවා නේද එනර්ජි එහෙම loss වෙන්නේ නැහැ ඇත්තටම. එනර්ජි වලට මොනවද ඇත්තටම වෙන්නේ? එනර්ජි convert වෙන්නේ ඇත්තටම from one to another. It's convert වෙන්නේ, but you can call it as a lost, but it's not really lost, right? So again, very important ecosystem function is this nutrient recycling and the energy flow, or the energy, how the energy is flowing in the, right? And another thing when you're talking about the ecosystem is something very important, the biodiversity, how diverse that ecosystem is, right? So why do we care about the biodiversity? Why in an ecosystem, what is the importance of having biodiversity, right? The reason is, if the diversity high, which means the most of the ecosystem services or ecosystem processes, I'll come to that one. You know the term ecosystem processes and services. There's high ecosystem services and processes if the diversity is very high, because it's very complex. That diversity, high diversity means that ecosystem is very complicated. That makes so complicated. The complicated ecosystems, which means they are more stable actually, because they have a lot of interconnections, a lot of sources of nutrients recycling, and so a lot of different producers, different uh, other level, right? So usually a very high biodiversity is actually, which means it's more stable communities, right? So it's very important that high diversity, keeping diversity is very important for the health of an ecosystem, right? The other thing is the one I talk about, this ecosystem processes, right? This is another thing we need to remember. There are ecosystem services and ecosystem processes. It's sometimes very difficult to distinguish, but others are the ecosystem, the the values or the resources that it provides. සමහර economic value එකක් තියෙන පුළුවන්, නැත්නම් මොනවා හරි අපිට දෙන ඒවා, that can be food or something like that, right? So these are goods and values, or maybe sometimes even some economic value, right? So but others are the ecosystem has lot of processes and services, right? මම කලින් කිව්වාගේ මේ දෙක ටික එකපාරම වෙන් කරලා ගන්න අමාරුයි මේ ecosystem services and processes කියනවා. අපි සමහරට ecosystem services කිව්වම හුඟක් තැන්වල මේ nutrient recycling ඒවත් include කරනවා, carbon dynamics එහෙම නැත්නම් carbon sequestration. හැබැයි නමුත් ඇත්තට මේක process එකක්. නම් at your level actually you just consider this as ecosystem services or ecosystem processes, but they're interconnected. So it's very important that the ecosystems provide both this the goods or the resources for us to use, or for the animals or whoever the resources used to use, but the ecosystem services. So these two components very important in an ecosystem, right? It's not the just the resources, right? Another very important component in an ecosystem are the ecosystem engineers. I think we have discussed previously as well. The ecosystem engineers are the whoever the animals who change the habitats in different ways, right? So one might think that if you change the habitat, that will destroy the ecosystem, but maybe some damages as well, but sometimes this damage will provide another benefit or another different ecosystems, right? So I have given here an example here. The like elephants, right? So they consider as ecosystem engineers because they um, change this uh, woodlands or the right, this kind of a forest into a sort of a grassland where a lot of other animals can survive on this grassland than this one, right? So of course, this forest also good, it's stable population, but the difference here is the right one, this kind of a the ecosystem, this will provide more opportunities for the other organisms, right? So um, in that way, the elephant is doing a good job for some other organism, right? So that's why we consider elephant as a ecosystem engineer, right? Likewise, there are many individuals serving as the ecosystem engineers, like mainly the organisms doing some changes in the habitat, like even the changes in the soil, right? Some beavers, even sometimes pigs, who change a little bit of ecosystem, so they can be ecosystem engineers, right? So again, keep in mind that ecosystem engineers, they do a little bit harm to the environment as well, but that harm will provide another opportunities, right? So that's how the natural systems work, right? But now we might think that humans also do harm, and that may be favorable for the ecosystem. Well, you can argue that way also. Maybe some of the changes that we do might helpful in the ecosystems, but the problem is we are doing too much harm. We change a lot of in the environment, and that is the the bad part of that what we are doing, right? Maybe small changes sometimes may be helpful, but not always. That's the thing, all right? Right. So the in ecosystem, these ecosystem engineers, they are also very important. They play a very important role in the maintaining an ecosystem, right? So another concept when we're talking about the ecology, it's not really something a part of the ecosystem, but we talk about these biomes, or sometimes we call biomes or whatever biomes, right? What is a biome? Right. I think you have heard about this term also previously, but it's something usually we talk about the biome, a form of plants, actually, right? For example, tropical rainforest, right? So it is one example for a biome. Um, what is the how we are actually classifying these biomes? One thing is mainly there are two main characters we are considering, that is the average temperature and the annual precipitation. Right, so these are the two main characters or the physical properties that we use. So based on actually these two, we can divide these different biomes. Here in the x-axis you have the temperature, and the y-axis you have the annual precipitation. That's the rainfall, right? Precipitation කියලා කියන්නේ දන්නවනේ rainfall. Rainfall temperature එක ගත්තාම අපිට මෙන්න මේ වගේ මේ විවිධ වර්ගයේ බයොම්ස් ටික අඳුනා ගන්න පුළුවන්. කොහොමද ඒක කරන්නේ? බලන්න මේ කුඩ අඩු temperature එකක් තියෙනවා. කුඩ අඩු rainfall එකක් තියෙන area and become tundra, right? And little bit of, right, but this case is a minus temperature, right? But a little bit higher temperature, but still very low annual precipitation, very low rainfall. And there is another type of biomes called taiga. I'm not too sure whether you have heard about this. Taiga and tundra is two different ecosystem, but you know the others on temperate, this forest, temperate rainforest and grassland, deserts to tropical forest to tropical rainforest. So this, you might have heard about this thing, but taiga and tundra. Tundra ගැන අහලා තියෙනවා. Taiga අහලා තියෙනවද දන්නේ නැහැ. හැබැයි the difference is the tundra, uh, the main difference is actually there is no plant. It's just the ice cap. The very much the cover is just the ice. I think in that case it's a tundra, but it's taiga. You will have some forest as well. So that's a bit different. Anyway, taiga or tundra, we don't have this cold climate, so it's not our main concern anyway. So in biomes, right? Now, now where does the term biome fall into? හරි අපි අහලා තියෙනවනේ මෙච්චර මීට කලින් නේද මේ බයෝම් කියන වචනේ. කොහෙද ඇත්තට මේ බයෝම් කියන වචනේ තියෙන්නේ? බයෝම් එකක් කියන එක අපේ අර පිරමිඩ් එකේ අපි කතා කරන්නේ individuals, from individuals to populations to communities to ecosystem and the landscape or biosphere. Where does the term biome fall into? කොහෙටද මේක දාන්න පුළුවන්? හරි මම මෙන්න මෙතන මේ ඩයග්‍රෑම් එකක මේ පෙන්නලා තියෙනවා. එතකොට biome එකක් එහෙම නැත්නම් biome එකක් කියලා අපි කියන එකක්. It's in between ecosystem and biosphere, right? Which means a biome is a collection of ecosystem, right? Ecosystem කීපයකම එකතුවක් තමයි ඒකට එහෙම biome එකක් කියලා කියන්නේ. biome එකක් ඇතුලේ එක එක විදිහේ ecosystems තියෙනවා. Right. So now we will understand how complicated this thing, right? And even there is another term called the landscape. The landscape ecology. මේ මොකක්ද එතකොට? මොකක්ද මේ landscape ecology කියලා කියන්නේ? මම ඒකත් ඉස්සරහට පෙන්නන්නම්. So things become very complicated as you go higher, or in this case is as you go along this pyramid. It's becoming very difficult to understand. Population, community level, we can understand many. Even ecosystem level, we can understand some. But anything beyond is very difficult to understand, like it's a biome or a biosphere. So many interactions we don't even understand. So it's very difficult to give some sort of a concepts. So that's one of the reason we are not going to learn very much about these things. It's very complicated, right? So the problem is, if you go down this pyramid, which means you have very becoming complicated as well, we have little understanding about these things, and we are not like 100% sure about anything that we're going to talk about. These things are because they're beyond our understanding, right? All right. So that's the basic setup for in the biosphere, right? And as I mentioned before, there was a term we talk about the scale. I have given some idea about the scale, the term scale, right? As again, you're in the first year, you might not go into that detail about the scale, but in the future, if you really want to be an ecologist, the term scale is very important. So that's why I have given some definitions here. Don't get confused about these things. Bit difficult, some sort of a thing, but simply taking, there are two things when we're talking about the scale: is the extent and the grain, right? The extent කියන වචන දන්නවනේ, it's about the size and the how මොකක්ද ඒක extent එක කියන කොච්චර distribute වෙලා තියෙනවා, කොච්චර දුරකට යනවාද කියන, right? But that can be a spatial, නැත්නම් space එකකින් වෙනත් පුළුවන්, නැත්නම් time කොච්චර කාලයක්ද කියන එකත් වෙන්න පුළුවන්. ඔය දෙකට තමයි extent කියලා කියන්නේ, right? then means spatial කියන්නේ කොච්චර දුරකට යනවද කොච්චර කාලයක් වෙනවද කියන දෙකේම එකතුව තමයි extend කියලා කියන්නේ. The size of a particular thing. Now the grain කියලා කියන එක තමයි අපිට කොච්චර deeply මේකේ හොඳම වචනේ තමයි අපි resolution කියන වචනේ. කොච්චර resolution එකකට මොනවද දෙයක් හොයාගන්න පුළුවන්ද කියන එක කොච්චර fine details මේ ගැන හොයන්න පුළුවන්ද කියන එක තමයි මේ grain කියලා කියන්නේ, right? So that's why it's a little bit difficult. But මේ දෙකේම එකතු තමයි ඇත්තටම මේ scale එකක් කියන්නේ, right? But for your easy understanding මේ scale කියන එක පෙන්වන්න පුළුවන් මෙන්න මේ maps දෙකකින්, right? This is a small scale map and this is a large scale map, right? මේ small scale large scale කියන එකේ ආපහුත් මතක තියාගන්න මේ කතා කරන්නේ මේ size එක විතරක්ම නෙමෙයි, right? Small large කියන තේරුම විතරක් නෙමෙයි. Small scale large scale කියන එකේ අර කලින් කියපු අර fine details. දැන් මේකේ බලන්නකෝ මේ map එකේ on your right hand මම හිතන්නේ ඔයගොල්ලන්ට මගේ mouse එක පේනවා ඇති. දකුණු පැත්තේ තියෙන map එකේ මේ කුඩා අමාරුයි මොන හරි විස්තරයක් හොයාගන්න. Right? So because there is no fine details. But in this kind of a large scale map, you can see even right, small things, even maybe a house or some things like in a Google map. Even sometimes you can go up to a house level, which means it's a large scale. You can get the fine detail, right? So, so if you are really an ecologist in the future, so you have to think of whether you are studying something on a small scale or a large scale. But keep in mind, remember that this small scale or large scale, it's not only talk about the actual size, but how much details you can get, right? So these two together, we consider as a the scale, large scale of, right? I hope you got the idea about that. Again, we talk about this the scales, whether it's in can be meters to kilometers to 1,000 kilometers, depend on what you are looking at, right? Another important thing that we need to consider in ecology, especially to the ecosystem level, is we call edge effect, right? I'm not too sure again whether you have heard about this term, edge effect. And I'm not too sure if there is a single term for this as well. But very simply, what is this edge effect is, for example, here, this is the ecosystem. As if you consider this as the boundary of an ecosystem, right? The boundary of an ecosystem, and the species in the middle here, and the species in this edge will have quite different setup. Why? Because the species in the edge, they have to deal with the other surrounding environment, maybe ecosystem, maybe another buffer zone, or maybe another river, whatever, maybe different habitats. Because of that, the interior species and the exterior species, or the who living in the external environment, they have to deal with different ways. Even with the same species, they might have differences, right? So if you still remember, we will talk something called ecotone. මතක තියන්නේද මම වචනයක් කිව්වා ecotone කියලා වචනයක් කිව්වා. මොකක් හරි එක පරිසරයක් අනිත් එකකින් වෙන්න ඕනේ ඒ හරියට අපි කියන ecotone එකක් කියලා. උදාහරණයකට beach එක. Right, so beach is an ecotone which differentiate the land or the terrestrial environment from the marine or the ocean, right? So that's why beach become ecotone. It's එතකොට මේ ඇත්තටම ගත්තොත් මේ edge එකකුත් ඒ වගේ ecotone එකක් වගේ. It's maybe a little different from the interior, right? So why I'm telling this, because if you are doing an ecological study, so you have to consider this as well, whether you are considering your study doing in the interior of an ecosystem or in the exterior, where they might have different interactions. Like if you are doing a study in the Singharaja forest, right in the middle and in the edges where there's a lot of influence from the human, and it's maybe a little different. If you do like survey here only, and you come to a conclusion about the Singharaja forest, that may be very wrong, because you have only considered the the outer edge, and this is we call the edge effect. ඔගොල්ලන්ට තව ටිකක් ඉස්සරහට ගියාම තේරෙයි මේවා කොච්චර වැදගත්ද කියලා. ඉකොලොජිකල් ස්ටඩි එකකදී මේ edge effect කියන එක අපිට ඒ වගේ දේවල් avoid කරගන්න ඕනේ. If you really want to do a study, then you have to consider edge, some samples from the edge as well as from the interior, right? And මෙතනම තියෙන තව එකක් තමයි මේ වගේ if there is disturbances to this sort of ecosystem, then an ecosystem divide into different regions, and we call this the fragmentation, right? This is another very important topic in the ecology. We call it fragmentation, the habitat fragmentation, right? We talk about this quite often now because of the human intervention in particular, right? Because people if you cut a road through this ecosystem, and this ecosystem divide into two, we call this habitat fragmentation. And this is what has happened in the Singharaja forest, that Lankagama, right? Constructing a road make the habitat fragmented, right? This is very true in particular in the highways, right? ලංකාවේ මේ highways දැන් ගොඩක් තියෙනවානේ. මේ highway වල තියෙන එක ප්‍රශ්නයක් තමයි මෙන්න මේ serious issue එකක් තමයි මෙන්න මේ කියන මේ habitat fragmentation එක. ඔයගොල්ලන්ට හොඳම උදාහරණය තමයි පෑලියගොඩ ඉඳන් highway එකේ කටුනායකට ගියොත් එහෙම ඔයගොල්ලන්ට පේනවා ඇති. දෙපැත්තේ මුතුරාජවල මේ මාර්ෂ් එක හරහා යන්නේ. එතකොට මේ කනෙක්ෂන් දැන් සම්පූර්ණයෙන් වගේ අයින් වෙලා තියෙනවා. මේ පැත්තේ හිටපු අයට ඒ පැත්තට යන්නත් බෑ, ඒ පැත්තේ හිටපු අයට මේ පැත්තට එන්නත් බෑ, right? So this is one of the problem with this large scale projects. So that result in a fragmentation. But there are a lot of options where we can get rid of this fragmentation. You can see here one example, this example from Germany, how they have construct this the highway, and there is a forest either side, and you have a corridor here, right? Corridor අහලා තියෙනව නේද? This one forest is connecting to another forest. It's just like another forest. They are constructed forest connecting one from another, and then the animals can move around with this kind of a corridor, right? So jungle corridors කියලා කියනවා මේවට. මේක natural එකක් නන් නෙමෙයි. හැබැයි naturally corridors ඉතිරි කරනවා. දැන් ලංකාවේ elephants ලට එහෙම when they want to cross from one forest to another, we have to provide some jungle corridors. Naturally තියෙන forests අපි ඉතුරු කරලා තියෙනවා ඒ corridors ඒවා එලි කරන්නේ නැතුව, then the elephants can freely move between forests, right? So similarly, if there is no natural thing, so then we have to have this kind of a artificial corridors, jungle corridors. So this is very important. And this is another example. Connecting these two habitats from the either side, they are connected. Even though road is constructed, but from the underneath the road, actually these are connected. So almost all the organisms, they can cross from one here to here, and because this is connected. Unfortunately, in Sri Lanka, most of the roads, they just divide the ecosystem into two. But there is some, I think this is in the central highway now, they have some areas they have constructed similarly, with some interconnections where the animals can go to here. I haven't been there, I've just seen in this picture. It is very important that we have this kind of a corridors connecting, right? So this is where we use this ecological understanding, right? Maybe like even the engineers, they have to think of in this, they need to have this biological thinking uh, to have this kind of a setup that support the ecology, right? All right, so that's some of the thoughts that we have to think of in the talking about the ecosystems, right? So this very simply, but then what is the term landscape ecology, right? So what is the difference from the from ecosystem to landscape ecology? So you see the sort of a definition, but it's not really a definition. Study of the pattern and interaction between ecosystems within a region of interest and the way the interaction affect ecological processes, right? It got complicated, but you see it's a patterns and interaction between ecosystems. So it's පැහැදිලිව මේ landscape ecology කියලා කියන්නේ ecosystem එකට වඩා එහාගේ එක ecosystem අතර තියෙන interaction එක ගැන කතා කරන්නේ කොහේ region එකක තියෙන ecosystem කීපයක එකතු, right? So now it is the same as the biome. එතකොට biome එකකුයි මේකකුයි එකක්මද? හැබැයි එහෙම කියන්නත් බෑ මොකද biome එකකදී අපි we are looking at particular temperature and as well as a rainfall, but in the landscape ecology we are not really considering that, right? All right, I hope you got some idea about that, right? Okay. Sorry. So that's this landscape ecology. Here, now if you talk about the landscape ecology again, as I mentioned before, this is going to be very complicated. Right? Sometimes this landscape ecology is a bit of a complicated thing. So because as not like a biome, the landscape it's depend on what you are looking at, right? So and it may be there's no particular definition for a landscape as well. So because of that, I'm not going to actually talk about the landscape, but if you are considering something as a landscape, we're talking about some heterogeneous area. Heterogeneous කියන දේ නෙමෙයි තේරෙනව නේද? විවිධ දේවල් වලින් හැදුණු එකතුවක් අපි heterogeneous කියලා කියන්නේ. එතකොට මේ it has no any particular definition, right? So you can consider few ecosystems together as a landscape, but that become very complicated. So because of that, so we just need to know the term landscape ecology, but it has no particular definition as well, right? So you can have your own definition for a landscape, but but in reality, we see this kind of a landscape ecology, right? If you are in a particular area, you do some studies, then actually you are studying this kind of landscape ecology because that has the human settlement, the maybe paddy fields or the agricultural lands, but maybe nearby the forests. But altogether, that's all actually the landscape ecology. So in reality, actually, the practical terms that we usually learn is actually the landscape ecology because there is no many areas without human intervention. But the problem with the landscape ecology is that since there is no particular definition, it will be a little difficult. So I'm not going to detail again. But if you put in all the terms that you learned previously into this, something like a dispersal, dispersion, now we can talk about everything here into a landscape or ecosystem. Uh, we can link all these terms now into, right, in reality, in practically, right? Even if you remember, we talk about this meta populations. මතක ඇති මම හිතන්නේ මම මෙහෙම වචනයක් පාවිච්චි කරා meta populations කියලා. මේ populations කියන ඒවත් ඇත්තටම තැන් තැන් වල ඉන්න populations සමහරවිට පොඩි වෙනස්කම් තියෙන්න පුළුවන්. They might have some genetic variations or maybe මම කලින් කිව්වේ reproductive variation ඒ වගේ දේවල් තියෙනවා. මේ populations කියනවා ඉන්නේ තැන් තැන් වල මේ ecosystem එකේ තැන් තැන් වල ඉන්න populations වෙනස්කම් තියෙනවා. ඒකට මේවා තමයි මේ meta populations කියලා කියන්නේ. මේවා සමහර ලාට එකිනෙක mix වෙන්නත් පුළුවන්. Right? Which is very important. Like if it is in the ocean, take as a coral reef එකේ ඉන්න මාළු එහෙම අපි කියන්නේ ඒගොල්ලෝ meta populations කියලා. සාමාන්‍යයෙන් ඒගොල්ලෝ එක reef එකක ඉන්න. හැබැයි they can go to another reef as well, right? So there can be a small variation in the populations, but it is very important that the genetic variation එක හරිම වැදගත් අර population එක genetic pool එක develop වෙන, right? So that's how these the terms we learned before, so we can link into ecosystem ecology, right? And connectivity ගැන අපි කලින් fragmentation ගැන කිව්වා. එහෙම නැත්නම් patchy fragmentation, and that ended up in a patchy environment, right? So habitat fragment වෙනවා කියලා කියන්නේ patchy distribution, right? So and the which means a patchy distribution නාම ecosystem එක බෙදිලා ගිහිල්ලා now the diversity will lost, right? And then when the diversity is lost, then that ecosystem won't be that stable, right? Now that is the reason, right? So if you divided the ecosystem into a smaller pieces, and that will result in the loss of biodiversity, and loss of biodiversity means the stability. The problem is that lose the stability of ecosystem, and you can imagine what will happen if this ecosystem is not stable. The whole ecosystem will collapse with time, over the time, right? So that's where we can link everything in together, right? Right, so I hope you got some idea about this ecosystem ecology, which is a very complicated thing, as I mentioned. But now the problem is that human intervention, right? With mainly because of the human intervention, that there's a lot of changes in the ecosystems from this deep fragmentation and the resulting patchy distribution, all these, and together with other many human influences, there are a lot of issues in the marine environment, right? So this many different human impacts has resulted in many issues in the marine in the ecosystems, not only marine, right, in the ecosystem. So that lead us to another topic to discuss. That's the human impact on the environment, right? So that's what we are going to talk in our next title, right? So that's only actually I'm going to talk about this very briefly on the ecosystems, which is going to be very complicated, as you already understand, right? Anyone has any questions or comments so far?